folks. My name is Don Kusler. I'm National Director of Americans for Democratic Action. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for a book event. We've done a number of these over the years, and we're excited about this one. I'm going to let us get right to the action. So, Jamal Watson Dr. Jamal Watson is a professor at Trinity Washington University. He's also the executive editor of Diverse Issues in Higher Education. And perhaps closest to our hearts is that Jamal is an ADA member and was once the chair of the Youth for Democratic Action. He's going to be talking with our author, Samuel Freedman, tonight. Jamal, take it away.
Thanks so much, Don, and I am so happy to be here to moderate this discussion with my former professor from Columbia University, Samuel G. Freedman. As Don mentioned, when I was an undergraduate student at Georgetown University in D.C., I was indeed the chair of the Youth for Democratic Action, and I had very fond memories of my involvement in the organization, and so happy to be back with you all today to moderate this discussion. And I see some old friends across the years who are also here, and so very, very excited to be engaged in this conversation. Samuel G. Freedman is an award-winning author, journalist, and educator. He has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and has won the National Jewish Book Award and the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Award. His columns for the New York Times about education and religion have received national prizes. He is a professor at Columbia University's Journalism School and has been named the nation's outstanding journalism and educator by the Society of Professional Journalists. So welcome, Sam. Glad to have you here for this conversation.
Jamal, it's such a delight to be doing this with you and also be doing it for people in the ADA because of the Humphrey connection.
Absolutely. And we'll talk a lot about that connection certainly tonight. Sam, when I remember hearing you talk about the purpose of writing a book, and I think one of the things I heard you say many years ago is that when you write a book, it has to answer some questions. So I guess the first question that I have for you is what was the question or the questions that you were hoping to answer by writing this book?
Well, Jamal, you remember exactly right. That's actually a bit of wisdom I've appropriated from one of my Columbia faculty colleagues, Michael Shapiro, that a book has to answer a question. And for me, the question in this book was, why does a very white guy, and I should say specifically a very white Christian guy from a very white Christian place, devote so much of his political life to advocating for the equality of American Blacks and American Jews? I think that was the single driving question for me, because there was nothing that's predictive of Hubert Humphrey becoming so deeply committed to these closely tied battles against racism and anti-Semitism. And I think what went with trying to answer that question about Humphrey was also trying to bring attention to the importance of the 1940s and the civil rights narrative. And for my purposes, it culminates with the 1948 Democratic Convention, when Humphrey, very much as part of an ADA insurgency, really forced Harry Truman into running as a civil rights candidate by pushing through a civil rights plank. But Humphrey's whole road there, out of this tiny hamlet in South Dakota where he grew up, could not have been, at all predicted by the demographics or anything else in his background.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And certainly you talk a lot about that background for him growing up in South Dakota. So I was wondering, what was that like for him, certainly as a young man?
I think the most important thing Humphrey gets out of childhood in South Dakota is he becoming, as I sometimes put it, a New Dealer before there's even a New Deal, because we're familiar with the fact that the country as a whole was plunged into the Depression after the stock market crash of 1929, and then the cascade of bank failures, dust storms, massive unemployment. and Franklin Roosevelt's response to it with the New Deal. But in the Dakotas, where Hubert Humphrey grew up, because of a severe drop in wheat prices in the early 1920s, and I'll spare you the deep explanation of why that happened, but it plunged the Dakotas into economic calamity almost a decade before the rest of the country. And it gave Humphrey this insight that you needed activist government, that you couldn't just depend on the charity of the local church, and that families fell into economic despair not because they were profligate or because they were foolish or because they were intemperate. They fell into economic distress because of forces far larger than their own decisions. And so I think Humphrey was prepared by those circumstances to become a New Dealer when in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt is elected, and in early 33, in the 100 days, New Deal legislation begins to move forward. So I think that's the most important thing Humphrey takes away from South Dakota. But it's incomplete. And what he adds to it happens at the end of the 1930s when he goes to graduate school at Louisiana State in Baton Rouge. Up to that point, he'd lived his whole life in the North, most of it in the upper Midwest and the Great Plains. The only reason he went to LSU for grad school is that by this time, because he'd had to stop out during his undergraduate years for 5 years to help his family survive the Depression. By the time he went back to finish, he was 28 years old, he was married, he had the first of his children, and he needed money. He needed graduate assistantship, which LSU gave him for the equivalent of about $8,500 in current currency amounts. But it's at LSU that A, he is immersed into a Jim Crow society for the first time, B, he makes Jewish friends for the first time, and C, tying it all together, he studies under an incredibly influential professor named Rudolf Eberle, who's an exiled anti-Nazi, part Jewish professor who, after having been stripped of his position, left penniless, and kicked out of Germany, was fortunate enough to get hired at LSU. And all of that in Baton Rouge, that's what allows Humphrey to combine the class-based politics of the New Deal with a real commitment to fighting forms of discrimination in this country. What he understands, and it's a vital lesson for now, is that economic equality and what we would now call, in a term I don't particularly like, but for lack of a better one, identity politics, these aren't feuding forms of liberalism. They may not be 100% congruent, but there's a lot of Venn diagram there. And Humphrey understood that. And that's what he took out of the childhood in South Dakota, plus the graduate school year, just literally 1 year at LSU.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating because as you write throughout the book, I mean, we begin to see Humphreys as someone who becomes a champion for civil rights, certainly, and who is adamantly opposed to anti-Semitism and racism as well. So it's very interesting to see that he's beginning to get sort of identities around these things at a very, very young age. Because I don't think a lot of people know that about.
No, I think when people, first of all, Humphrey hasn't been written about nearly enough, but when he is written about, somehow there's sort of this assumption that he was born at 35 or 40 years old, magically being committed to these issues, or that it was just an ideology that he found that made sense of the world. Whereas Humphrey, his politics were experiential, and he had to be hit in his gut and in his heart. And then that would connect with ideologies that were out there that suddenly made sense of what his personal experience was and answered the compassion he had and his desire to correct, the defects of the world. Not by himself, of course, but he was a fantastic, it goes beyond being an ally, to use a current term, but really a partner with Blacks, a partner with Jews in these issues. And Jamal, the last element I want to mention that I think is important is that Humphrey was also very much formed by the social gospel form of Protestantism. And even though his part of South Dakota was really dominated by a form of fundamentalism that was concerned almost entirely with personal purity, with sexual abstinence, with temperance. He was brought up not even being able to dance with a girl, but through his local pastor, he began what became really a lifelong involvement with the social gospel movement. And the social gospel told Protestants that their role was to create the kingdom of God on earth. And that was actually the term they used, the kingdom of God. And the way you did that wasn't through personal purity. It's not that they were against it, but it was primarily you support organized labor. You reach out across racial lines. You reach out across religious lines. And I think that also gave Humphrey an ethos that was really important and that frankly meshed extremely well with the secular liberalism of the ADA.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are characters that you introduce us to in the book who I think in some ways were very foundational to helping Humphrey get to where he needed to be, particularly on the issue of race. And Cecil Newman was
Right.
one of my favorite characters in the book. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Cecil Newman.
Yeah, thank you for asking about him. When my editor finished reading the manuscript, he said Cecil Newman is the conscience of the book. And I said, you're right. Cecil Newman was the founder and editor and publisher of the major Black newspaper in Minneapolis, The Spokesman, which, by the way, is still being published and edited by his granddaughter to this day.
Wow.
And for 18 years of doing journalism in Minneapolis, before Humphrey comes back to Minneapolis after grad school in 1940, from 1922 to 1940, Cecil Newman's been fighting what almost felt like a one-person battle against the rampant racism in Minneapolis. And he's been calling out police brutality in ways that really eerily anticipate the murder of George Floyd, the bigotry of labor unions that won't have Black members, the bigotry of breweries that won't hire Black workers, the coded language the mainstream newspapers use when they deign to write about Black life in Minneapolis, which is almost always about crime and nothing but crime. And so Newman has really been waiting in a way for someone who has political power to come and adopt these issues, because the Black community in Minneapolis is maybe 1 or 2% of the total population. So even a really mobilized Black community doesn't have a lot of electoral clout to force these issues into, the center of the political discussion. And when Humphrey gets to Minneapolis, the kind of education about racism and anti-Semitism that he'd begun in Baton Rouge at LSU continues in Minneapolis, and it continues very much as he gets to know Cecil Newman. And Newman is really the most important person in Humphrey's evolution as an activist on civil rights. And what Humphrey brings to Newman is someone who's never existed in Minneapolis before, which is someone with great political ambition, great political skills, who, in spite of the electoral illogic of taking on discrimination in a city that's overwhelmingly white Protestant, decides to take on those very issues. And so now Newman has a kind of a bigger megaphone than he had ever had through the pages of The Spokesman.
Interesting. Want you to tell me, if you can, about Samuel Schneier as well, but also talk a little bit about how Minneapolis became such a place filled with so much racism and anti-Semitism at the time. Like, what is that backdrop to that?
It's a really important background. I think a lot of people, even notwithstanding the murder of George Floyd, have tended to think of Minneapolis as this very, very blue city,
right,
which in some ways it is. But for the first 45 years of the 20th century, basically from the turn of the century, when you begin to get large enough populations of Blacks and Jews to kind of hit the prejudice switch for the white Protestants, before their numbers had been so small, they didn't present any perceived threat to white Protestants, nor did the Catholics, who were also a minority in Minneapolis. But from that point at the turn of the 20th century up to 1945, when Humphrey's elected mayor, the racism and the anti-Semitism is absolutely pervasive. And a lot of it is really born out of the combination of demography and religion. The demography piece is that Minneapolis, as I've said before, is overwhelmingly Protestant, Scandinavian, German, British Isles, Northern European. And because it's so demographically dominated by that population, that population sees no need to make any compromise with any minority groups. The really interesting and revealing contrast is with St. Paul. And in many parts of the Twin Cities, to get from Minneapolis to St. Paul literally involves just crossing a street. It's not even divided in a lot of places by the Mississippi River. And yet St. Paul had a totally different civic culture, because St. Paul was a city that had a plurality of Catholics. And those Catholics knew that while they were the plurality in St. Paul, they were a minority in the region of the upper Midwest. So Catholics in St. Paul made political alliance with Blacks and Jews in order to have electoral power. So this kind of old-fashioned multi-ethnic, multiracial political machine in St. Paul. That's totally not the case in Minneapolis. And the other factor in Minneapolis is because the dominant religious voice is fundamentalist Protestantism and extremely intolerant and rampantly anti-Semitic. That kind of sanitizes the expression of anti-Semitism in public life. The attitude about Blacks by the white Protestants in Minneapolis is not enlightened, but it tends to, and at times is quite brutal. There is an instance in the book I write about a Black family moving into a white neighborhood and having their home besieged by literally 6,000 whites night after night until they ultimately drive the family out. But the attitude about Blacks among many of these fundamentalist Protestants in Minneapolis was condescension, dehumanization. The attitude about Jews was a different variation, and it was very much born out of things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it was this contradiction that anti-Semites are always able to hold, that Jews are simultaneously revolutionaries, Bolsheviks, but also capitalists. Somehow they can be both at the same time. And so because these forms of racism and anti-Semitism appear to have religious sanction in Minneapolis, that also gave them a certain really dangerous legitimacy.
Yeah. And tell us about Samuel Schneier.
So Sam Schneier is really kind of the equivalent person to Cecil Newman on the Jewish side of Minneapolis. And in fact, Sam Schneier and Cecil Newman were friends. They fought a lot of battles together. They really understood their battles against anti-Semitism and racism, particularly against the backdrop of the rise of fascism in Germany and World War II, that those two battles were one battle. And Sam Schneier was a lawyer who couldn't get hired by any reputable law firm in Minneapolis because he was a Jew. And so he'd been making his living playing jazz piano in the nightclubs throughout the 1930s. And by the late 1930s, there was a surge of interest in Minneapolis on the part of a group called the Silver Shirts. And the Silver Shirts were a pro-Nazi group. They're actually modeled on Hitler's Silver Shirts. And they had a very welcome audience for them in Minneapolis. And they attracted not only people who were resentful and disenchanted and looking for a scapegoat because of the Depression, but a lot of the elites of the society, the president of the Board of Ed, the president of the Industrial Association, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and the Jewish community was so alarmed by the popularity of the Silver Shirts and by the dismissive attitude about them on the part of the Minneapolis establishment that they pulled together, the Jewish community, enough money to give Sam Schneier a salary to basically be a one-man anti-defamation league. And whereas Cecil Newman's way of fighting bigotry was to call it out through the pages of his newspaper and try to name and shame where possible, Sam Schneier really was doing intelligence gathering and was sending spies into these right-wing extremist meetings, into the worship services led by these, horribly bigoted ministers, and trying to assemble information which he would try to leak to the police or to the FBI or to the newspapers. But just like Cecil Newman, he didn't have enough clout. The Jewish population in Minneapolis also 1 or 2%. And in spite of Sam Schneier's most avid efforts, he made very little headway until Humphrey gets to town. And Humphrey and Schneier, like Humphrey and Newman, become friends, become partners in this battle. And Humphrey gives Schneier what Schneier has never had before, which is access to political power.
Wow. So fascinating to think about those coalitions that are formed And we often think about Black and Jewish kind of partnerships
Yeah.
and coalitions during the 60s, but here you had, a Black and a Jew working very closely around civil rights, even, early on, which
I
is
think it's much earlier. I think you can't accurately date the Black-Jewish alliance to the mid-50s of the civil rights movement as is commonly done. It's a lot more accurately placed in the 30s or certainly the 40s because the global war against fascism and the idea that Black GIs described with the slogan double V,
yeah,
victory over fascism abroad and then victory over Jim Crow at home. Jewish GIs didn't have that phrase, but they had the same idea. And this idea that Newman in his editorials constantly articulated of a dual battle against these two forms of hatred, racism and anti-Semitism, that really brought together the Black-Jewish alliance incredibly powerfully during the war years.
yeah, yeah. I'm going to ask a couple more questions for sure, but I also want to invite all of our attendees to put your question in the chat box below, and I will try to get to as many of those before the hour is up. You started this book in 2015, and you moved, I believe, to Minnesota. Can you talk a little bit about the process of researching and just writing this fascinating book, which again, I will
Thank you.
commend that you all buy
Thank
because
you.
it is very, very good.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamal. Um, well, I did start in 2015, and I'll just say one thing quickly about that, which is it was such a change in the way I felt about the book, starting a book during the end of the second Barack Obama term, starting it a few months before marriage equality was declared a constitutional right, and feeling like we're seeing, this interracial, interfaith, inclusive, democratic, both lowercase d and uppercase d coalition really moving towards consolidating political power in the country. I thought I was writing an important work of history and biography, but then after November 2016, I realized I was writing current events and that Humphrey's battle and the ADA's battle against and Cecil Newman and Sam Shiner's battle against right-wing extremism and forms of autocracy in the 1940s really uh, painfully anticipates our battle in the Trump era. Anyway, but I did over the 8.5 years I've worked on the book spend increasing amounts of time in Minneapolis. I never totally moved there, but partly because the pandemic made havoc with my in-person teaching schedule at Columbia Journalism School, which paradoxically gave me a little more time to be in Minneapolis. Ultimately got to the point of spending, about half of every year there trying to really have access on a day in, day out basis to the archival materials there, primarily about Humphrey, but about other people as well. And also to have closer access to South Dakota, where Humphrey grew up. And I think also an important way to really learn a place by spending a lot of time there, a lot of time, not only in Minneapolis, but a lot of time out in the Dakotas um, as well. And that was obviously a lot more easily done from a basis in Minneapolis than to go back and forth between New York and the Dakotas.
You start the prologue of the book in 1977, and there you have Hubert Humphrey, an older man who's getting an honorary degree, I believe, at the University of Pennsylvania.
Correct.
And as you read that prologue, you almost feel really, or I felt sad for Humphrey. I mean, clearly he has undergone cancer. He's just, he's not the same man that you read about often in history, and it was very sad. I was wondering, why did you decide to start the book there and then kind of go backwards to really tracking his early life and basically ending the book right in
Right.
1948?
Well, I felt that I wanted the book to really focus on his early life. I sometimes joke that there's that one aphorism that says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. But the second definition is writing any subject matter that Robert Caro already covered.
Mm.
And because Robert Caro has written really brilliantly about Humphrey in, Master of the Senate, as well as the later Johnson volumes, with I'm sure more to come in the fifth and final volume, I felt that a lot of what Humphrey had done in the Senate and with the enactment as LBJ's vice president of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Voting Rights Act of 65 and Fair Housing Act of 66 had been covered very well. But I felt that his formation as a person and as a politician had been dealt with hardly at all. And this goes to actually one of the questions that's in the chat, which is that you can't understand how Humphrey got on the national stage without understanding the national reputation he had built as mayor of Minneapolis. That the fact that within 3 years he took a city that was notorious for its its racial hatred and its anti-Semitism, as well as its anti-Catholic and anti-Nisei Japanese um, attitudes, and made it into this national model of legislation on, fair employment, fair housing, an effort of police reform. Within 3 years, he totally remade Minneapolis's image. And it wasn't just cosmetic. He made deep changes there. And that's what puts him on the national stage. That's why he ends up with the leadership role he has in 1948 and within the ADA. In terms of starting the book towards the end of his life, I felt, Jamal, that if I was going to pay most of my narrative attention to this really valorous early part of his political career, I had to also account for the fact that the Humphrey people know is the later reviled, ridiculed, disparaged, discredited Humphrey. And I had to tell a reader, I'm aware of that. And Humphrey was aware of it too. He, at the end of his life, talked about how supporting the Vietnam War was the most grievous mistake he had ever made. And when I found out, this is the crazy way things can happen with books sometimes. One of my high school classmates had gone to Penn. We both graduated college in 1977. My classmate Roberta Woodman at Penn, me at the University of Wisconsin. And she had seen something I'd put up on Facebook early in my work on the Humphrey book. And she said, oh, Hubert Humphrey gave the commencement address when I graduated from Penn. And so I got a copy of the text, and in reading it, I realized he was giving this address in the exact same convention hall where he gave his 1948 speech. And so the idea that you're here at the most luminous moment of your political life, and you're also here later in your life worried about being laughed at, being heckled, knowing that you're dying, I thought was incredibly poignant, but it also gave me a way narratively to account for the fact that by this time, Humphrey had made his terrible mistake of supporting the Vietnam War, and he had been viewed as a traitor by a lot of his liberal supporters. And so it let a reader know I'm aware of that. I'm not eliding that. But I also want to let you know what preceded that part of Humphrey's life. In a way, people remembered they felt betrayed by Humphrey, but they'd forgotten why they felt betrayed. If he hadn't done such incredible work on civil rights, what would the letdown of Vietnam have been all about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, there are many on this Zoom call who are familiar, of course, with Humphrey's longstanding relationship and work with ADA, but you spend a lot of time writing about that in the book. And so can you talk a little bit about the compelling attraction for Humphrey to ADA, what it stood for, all of that?
Well, I think Humphrey was really in sync with ADA very deeply, as among the founding people, along with that incredible group, Eleanor Roosevelt and Reinhold Niebuhr, and James Weschler and Walter Reuther and A. Philip Randolph. I mean, talk about the A team of American liberals. And because I think the ADA spoke to two things that were essential to Humphrey. One was a liberal agenda, including very much on civil rights, and the other was a fervent anti-communism. And Humphrey was really formed on the anti-communist issue by his experiences in Minnesota. And I'll spare everyone all the, inside baseball of Democrat Farmer Labor Party politics in Minneapolis and Minnesota, but suffice it to say that as the Cold War and was happening globally, as Henry Wallace and progressives and people, out of the Popular Front were breaking with the Democratic Party over things like the Marshall Plan and their whole perception of whether Stalin was could be a peacetime ally or was truly a treacherous expansionist person. That was being played out really feverishly in Minnesota because Minnesota actually had a very active Communist Party movement. It was atypical of probably any state in the Union, except maybe New York State, for having a really significant presence of CP members and Popular Front allies and um, you, you know naive fellow travelers. And this all came to a head between 1946 and 1948 in a battle over who would control the DFL party in Minnesota. The CP faction and its allies were the anti-communist liberals, led by people like Humphrey and Eugenie Anderson and or Freeman. And they triumphed, but it was bitter all around. And people who had been friends and allies purged or attempted to purge one another. And that experience gave Humphrey a real clear insight about the importance of having a liberalism that was separated from the party. Humphrey talked a lot about the fact, he said, I really admired how hard the CP members worked. They were the hardest workers on these campaigns before that coalition broke up. But he said, I never trusted them because I remembered one day in the 1930s, the Communist Party was the leading edge of the global anti-fascist movement. The next day, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact happens, and it's an imperialist war that the US shouldn't enter. Then the next day, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and the anti-fascist coalition is back on offer again. And that gave him a deep distrust. And I think that experience, that political education of a very harsh type, coupled with the ADA's fervent commitment to civil rights as well as economic justice, I think made it exactly the right place for him. And it put him, in partnership with people who he'd already been working with de facto on a variety of national issues. And it gave him an organization to move through. And so I think all that makes the fit so important. And if you were going to take on Harry Truman and the Democratic establishment at the 1948 convention, you had to do it organizationally. It couldn't just be a bunch of individuals saying, we want to push the civil rights agenda, or earlier than that, we even want to see if we can replace Harry Truman at the top of the ticket. You needed organizing on your own side, and the ADA provided that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a comment that Amy Isaacs writes is that the wonderful book ends with Humphrey's and ADA's role in moving the Democratic Party to a more positive position on civil rights. And
Yes.
That happens over time, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, 1948 really is dispositive in ways a lot of people don't understand. By compelling Harry Truman to run on civil rights, it leads by, which was done through having the delegates go over and against Truman's wishes to vote for a civil rights plank. First time the Democratic Party had ever had it. FDR had never been willing to go there. 2 weeks after the convention, Harry Truman desegregates the military and the federal workforce. The weekend before Election Day 1948, he becomes the first major party candidate to give a speech, presidential candidate to give a speech in Harlem, which is front page news in every Black newspaper in the country. And that leads to a surge of Black voters. That is why Truman wins over Tom Dewey. But it also is the beginning of forming the Democratic Party as we now know it, as this interracial, interfaith coalition, and ousting the extremists. And even though Adlai Stevenson and John F. Kennedy are timid on civil rights and try to entice the Southerners back in, really 1948 ran the experiment, can we win as a party without the South? And it says, yes, you can. And that sets the table for Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey in the mid-60s. The other thing I want to go back to, and it was one of the great points in the chat, is talking about the ADA. One of Humphrey's close friends and allies in it was Andy B. Miller. Andy B. Miller had been a state legislator in Wisconsin for the Progressive Party in the 30s, then was very active in organized labor, then became a Democrat and won 1 or 2 terms in Congress from the Milwaukee area before losing his seat in the midterm wipeout in 1946. But he was the person who did the scout work that allowed Hubert Humphrey to give his famous Into the Bright Sunshine speech at the 48 convention. Because the way it worked at the convention is to try to get a platform plank that Truman didn't want you to first go through a platform committee. Humphrey lost there. The civil rights plank was defeated there. But Andy B. Miller had gone to the trouble to learn all these really abstruse parliamentary rules for the Democratic National Convention. And he understood how many delegates you had to have signed up to ask for a floor vote. And he did that. And when he presented that documentation to Sam Rayburn, the longtime Speaker of the House and the chair of the DNC convention, the presiding officer, Rayburn says, "Uh-oh, the fat's in the fire now." And you know what that idiom means, like throwing fat on a barbecue, it's going to flare up. But B. Miller's attention to the parliamentary detail is the one reason Humphrey gets to give that speech at all. If B. Miller hadn't known what the rules were and attended to them, Humphrey wouldn't have been allowed to speak. The civil rights plank would have died in the committee. And, it's an important lesson on, I think, inside politics and outside politics. And this is something else I think 48 teaches us, is that inside the conventional, with Humphrey's oratorical skills, with B. Miller's knowledge of the rules, with the pragmatic decision by big city bosses like Ed Flynn and David Lawrence and Jake Arvey, who weren't particularly liberal on the whole, but realized you needed to give Black voters streaming into the North in the Great Migration reason to vote Democratic. That's the inside game. Outside is A. Philip Randolph leading protest marches every single day of the convention as part of a months-long campaign he'd been leading to urge Black young men not to register for the draft and not to serve if called up until Harry Truman desegregated the military. And you needed both of those. You needed the inside acumen and you needed the outside mass mobilization. And after the convention, after this triumph of the civil rights plank, there were exchanges of letters and telegrams between Humphrey and A. Philip Randolph's people in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, basically each complimenting the other, and he's saying, "We couldn't have done it without you." They understood that you had to have both the mass movement and the insiders. One or the other wasn't going to get the job done. And I think a lot of times, not you in the ADA, but I think a lot of times people forget that, and particularly a lot of younger voters tend to think if we have the mass movement, that takes care of everything, but it doesn't.
Yeah, inside outside strategy for sure. Yeah, yeah. So if there are any questions, again, please put those in the box. Sam, I know that you've talked about the need to fill in some of the historical gaps as it relates to Humphrey, and I was wondering, how did you do that in this book? And I know that was one of the goals that you were looking to.
All right. Well, I think I just tried to go through everything archivally that I could find. I think what was most important is that there are two tranches of Humphrey papers at the Minnesota State Historical Society. The public papers anyone can walk in and look at. So if you want to read his correspondence as mayor or senator, or all the interesting stuff related to the Civil Rights Act of '64, anyone can walk off the street and request it. But there's a set of family and personal papers that are only open if you have the approval of Humphrey's executor, his son, Hubert III, who everyone knows as Skip. And very fortunately for me, Skip Humphrey, early in this project, gave me permission to work in the family and personal papers. And that's where you see really the inner person and a lot of the formation of the personality and of the political identity. It comes up there and also helps explain a lot of what's found in the public papers later. And then I just also said to myself early on two things, Jamal. I didn't want to write a great man, or for that matter, woman in history book. I wanted to look at who was influencing Humphrey, who was partnering with him, and also who he was fighting against. And I also wanted not to write the white savior book, or for that matter, the Christian savior book in terms of his fight against anti-Semitism. So I was adamant about finding people like Cecil Newman and Sam Shiner and Rudolph Aberle. And as soon as I sort of locate them as being important, then I would do a huge amount of research on them to try to understand where did they come from? What had their experience been? How did they interact with Humphrey? And so, in Cecil Newman's case, he didn't leave personal papers, and he and Humphrey lived in the same city, so they, didn't need to write letters, which meant unfortunately I didn't have correspondence. But I read every published word Cecil Newman wrote from 1922 to 1948.
Wow.
And ended up with like a 28,000 word long Word document with excerpts that I could draw upon. Um, and with Sam Shiner, partly because he did so much intelligence gathering against extremists, there was more of a paper trail to draw on with from him. But it was really trying to find everything that not only Humphrey left, but that bore on his work. Finding out about Rudolph Aberle at LSU compelled me to make several trips to the archives at LSU and to read Aberle's own papers, but also an amazing set of letters his wife was writing, mostly in German, to her sister, who's married to a British Army officer. And I got a bunch of those letters translated, and they gave the really granular detail of the Aberle's life in Baton Rouge at this time, where on the one hand, their neighbors are like ratting them out as Nazi spies, and the FBI is coming, to interrogate them, when in fact they're fervent anti-Nazis who are wrestling with how publicly they want to talk about that at a time when the country is so isolationist. So it was really trying to develop everyone also around Humphrey, and so then I could really situate Humphrey within this constellation of other people.
Wow, so fascinating, so fascinating. Here's a question. Was there any indication of Humphrey trying to reach out later to the African-American woman who cared for him, his family, and children in Baton Rouge?
Yeah, this is the Humphrey housekeeper during the year that they're in Baton Rouge named Maggie. There's nothing that ever gives her last name. And I could never find evidence that Humphrey wrote to her later, but I also never had her surname. And so that makes it much harder to search. I even had a genealogist who I've worked with on parts of this book trying to locate her, both of us looking in the census for a Black woman named Maggie. Humphrey talked about her being in her late teens or early 20s at the time she was working for the family. So someone who would have been, 18 to 22 or 23 years old in 1939 and 40. But the problem is that Maggie is a common enough name that there was no one who stuck out in the census as being the most likely person. There were a few distant possibilities, but I was never able to locate her, which was frustrating because I would have wanted to then track down her descendants. And that's where maybe you find those people sitting with letters that Humphrey had written to her later on.
Yeah, yeah. Another question. Can you elaborate on how you talk about the duality of Humphrey's legacy, recognizing both the good and the bad, in a way relatable to people today?
Sure. Well, that's a
question
question that always comes up as well. I think one of the goals of the book for me was to give Humphrey a 360-degree treatment, the way, thanks to Robert Caro's work and the play and HBO adaptation all the way, we can look at LBJ now and hold the catastrophe of Vietnam in one hand and his remarkable legislative record on civil rights and the Great Society on the other. And I kept wondering all the years I was working on this book, why don't people look at Humphrey with 360 degrees of knowledge too? And I never wanted to exculpate him on Vietnam. And it was easier for me not to exculpate him because Humphrey didn't exculpate himself. And there's some of that in the epilogue of the book. He was aware of the terrible error he made. But although I don't write about this in the book, when this question comes up, what I also say to people is there's a tendency to exceptionalize Humphrey as if he was the only liberal who made the mistake of supporting the Vietnam War. But Bayard Rustin did, at least at the outset. A. Philip Randolph did, Walter Reuther did, a lot of the anti-communist liberals did, because they had, out of their own factional battles against the Communist Party over the years, which is very much true of socialists like Rustin, for instance, a real wariness of communism, and it made them, yes, in retrospect, too soft a touch for the domino theory. They overinterpreted it to Vietnam. And it was a terrible error, and almost all of them disavowed their support along the way. But it's not like Humphrey was the one person to be wrong on that. And the other thing I try to point out to people is that Humphrey was a cold warrior. And if you look at him purely as a liberal and don't understand he was a Cold War liberal, you're missing something important about him.
Yeah. And to that point, there's a question about, again, why he wound up supporting the Vietnam War, which I think you kind of touch on. But can you also talk about the relationship that he has with Lyndon B. Johnson?
Right. Well, I would defer to what Caro has written
Mhm.
on that very much. But what Humphrey talked about, and I said some of this in the book, is that he was aware that there's a perception that he had supported the war just because Johnson forced him into it. And basically what happened, I think a lot of you probably know about this, but early in the Johnson presidency, Humphrey and a few other people in the administration put together an internal memo saying this war is going to be a calamity. We've got to find a way to extricate ourselves. And Johnson was indignant, thought it was disloyal, and froze out Humphrey for about a year until Humphrey made a goodwill visit to Vietnam and began to speak more supportively about the war. But I also think that Humphrey was able to do two things at the same time, to have misgivings, doubts about the war, and to find a way to genuinely talk himself into it. Johnson did the same thing. We know that in 65, Johnson's and 64, Johnson's on the White House tapes talking to Richard Russell about what a mess this is that the Kennedys dropped in my lap. And I wish I could get out of this thing, but the Kennedys are going to say I'm weak if I do. Johnson knew it was a mistake. He's saying so to Richard Russell. And at the same time, he's escalating. And I think Humphrey, in a very parallel way, could see, the oncoming disaster, but also was able to rationalize um, escalating for many years. But the other thing, again, to remember is that just like LBJ, once he decided he wouldn't run again, had a bombing pause, Humphrey was running towards the end of his campaign on peace talks. And it was one of Nixon's, trademark dirty tricks to go behind the back of the existing American presidential administration and offer the South Vietnamese government some unspecified better deal if they wouldn't participate in peace talks. And so they didn't. And that hurt Humphrey in the final days of the campaign. And interestingly, well, he didn't ask this, but it's relevant, I suppose, because J. Edgar Hoover was wiretapping everybody for every reason. Hoover had wiretapped the Nixon offices and had the evidence of Nixon's slimy behind the scenes deal with the South Vietnamese government. And Hoover gave that information to Johnson and Humphrey. And Johnson and Humphrey decided, when they got that information a couple of days before the 68 election, it will be too destabilizing for our democracy to reveal this, even though it's true. People will think we're making it up. We have to try to win even without this. And so they took the high road and they lost. And
Yeah.
one reason Humphrey narrowly lost was because of the South Vietnamese scuttling the idea of peace talks beginning.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, very interesting. I guess we're coming to the end of our hour, and actually we'll get in maybe one or two more questions. But I'm just curious to know the reaction you've received around the book since it came out. I believe in July this summer.
Yes,
And just, I mean, it's such a page turner
thank
and
you.
so well written. And I was just curious to know, the response that you've gotten, or what have you been surprised about
Well, I've
as you've been
been
on tour?
Well, listen, with any book, this is my 10th book, you never know what the reaction is going to be. So I was incredibly heartened by the response all around, by, the prominence of the reviews, by how positive they were, by how many people were interested in having me talk about the book like this. And what's been interesting is that even a lot of people who knew about Humphrey haven't known that much about 48 and the convention and its, really tremendously important role in American liberalism and in civil rights. A lot of people have been unaware of the civil rights movement of the 40s and the formation of the Black Jewish Alliance in that decade. And so it's been just great to know that there's, a passion to be reacquainted or acquainted for the first time with that history. And as an author, that's all you can ask for.
Yeah. Well, it also seems to me that the teaching of what happened in 1948 seemed almost incomplete, in terms of what we've been told, in terms of Humphrey and his role, when it was much more nuanced and
Right.
complicated, for sure.
Well, I think there's a prevailing sense that the modern civil rights movement begins in 54 with Brown versus Board of Ed, and 55 with the Montgomery bus boycott, and then of course moves through, the lunch counter sit-ins and the freedom rides and the passage of the mid-60s laws and so on. But in fact, there was, tremendously important activity in the 40s that had been kind of overlooked. Um, the desegregation of the military was a gigantic step in civil rights. And yet, on the chronology of the movement, that doesn't get the traction that Brown versus Board of Ed does. And although I'm hoping the Rustin biopic will help address this to some degree, A. Philip Randolph has been really lost to our collective memory. People know about Dr. King as they should, but how many people know about A. Philip Randolph?
Yeah, no, that's important. And Tad Daly writes that next time he's visiting DC from LA, he will stop and pay homage to the marvelous statue of A. Philip Randolph in Union Station.
Oh,
So,
I didn't know he had one there. I'm going to look for that the next time I'm in DC.
absolutely.
I spent some good days reading some of Randall's papers at the Library of Congress, though.
Yeah. Well, we are at time, and again, I would encourage you all to get a copy of the book as a holiday gift, or just for anyone that you know. It is such an important read, and I'm very, very grateful, Sam, that you took the time to spend with us this evening. It's also Giving Tuesday, and
Yes.
so we are justifiably proud of ADA's history. And now I encourage all of you to dig into your wallets and to make a contribution to preserving this important history of ADA, and to go to the website adaction.org and make a contribution. And with that, again, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to turn it over to Don to close this out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I just say one thing quickly? If anyone wants to be in touch more, I put my email address in the chat, sgf1@columbia.edu. And Helen Rosenthal, who is the youngest delegate, or Sue Rosenthal, please contact me. I want to talk more to you. So promise me, Sue Rosenthal, you'll email me.
All right. Don?
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Sam and Jamal, for a wonderful chat. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this. There will be, a video of this. I'm going to send it out to everyone who registered. I hope that you'll take a look at it and you'll share it around, with your friends and so forth. I'll include, links to ADA activities, but certainly the book again. What a great event. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks so much to all of you. Take care.